Hey YouTube, what's going on? So, today on Brennan's Reef, we actually have a very special guest. We are going to be interviewing Humblefish, and we're going to be talking about improper medication being done at a wholesaler and retailer level and what that means for the hobby. Is it a simple case of some medication is better than nothing, or is it actually a disservice to the hobby and the hobbyists within it? Stick around, watch through the video. You should get a ton of useful information, and let's get to it.
All right. Well, thank you for doing this today. I was super excited when I got your response back to that email. It was a little, kind of surreal because I've seen a lot of your videos and everything. So then to actually, get the opportunity to, talk to you and go over something which I haven't seen a lot of information about.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
So I guess let's kind of jump in. So for those of you who don't know, I am here with Humblefish today, and we're going to be talking a little bit about what the side effects of not properly quarantining are, and more specifically, in a wholesale, situation where the fish is not at the hobbyist level yet. So I guess, to kind of sum up how we got here, I bought fish from a store close to me, and they medicate their fish, but they keep everything in a barely therapeutic. They keep it 1.5 ppm copper, and they keep them there for a week. So, I think they're high risk fish, like their tangs and stuff like that is what they keep in that system. And then they just move it onto their display tanks, and it's free to go. And so I got a hippo tang, and when I got that fish, it quickly, before I had it in medication, developed a lot of spots and everything. And that's kind of what prompted me, for this of what are, in your opinion, what are the effects of improperly quarantining, and is it something where it's better than nothing? So, we should be happy they're doing it, or is it, actually a little worse for the hobby, in your opinion?
So it kind of sounds like where you bought the fish from, they were keeping the fish in subtherapeutic copper. A lot of local fish stores do this, wholesalers do this, and what they are doing is they're keeping them in a copper level that is not therapeutic, it's subtherapeutic, and what that does is it keeps most of the parasites off the fish, not 100%, it doesn't eliminate them all, but it suppresses most of the parasites, but it's at such a low level that the fish aren't unaffected, because some fish are negatively impacted by copper. It can cause appetite suppression, lethargy, and other side effects. So by running a fish through subtherapeutic copper, the fish have minimal side effects to that, and it's keeping the parasites at a sublethal concentration, meaning parasites are still coming and going from the fish, but not at such a concentration to overwhelm and kill the fish. I understand why retailers and wholesalers do this. It's what I call a disease management practice. However, unfortunately for hobbyists, what happens is you're buying a fish that looks clean, but unfortunately, and you're not really seeing symptoms of parasites. However, that fish is still having, like, say, a few parasites on it. So when you put it in your display tank and you are it's non-medicated water, the potential exists for then the parasites are able then to start reproducing, and usually within about 30 days you have an outbreak on your hands, and fish start dying. The other concern that I and others have about subtherapeutic copper is as not the fish themselves, but as the parasites. So like at the wholesale level, as those parasites in the wholesale facility are constantly being exposed to subtherapeutic copper, we wonder, does the potential exist for like with antibiotics, where there's a resistance begins to develop.
A resistant strain, essentially. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. And we've actually seen some evidence of that, because we've seen like copper levels, like used to be with chelated copper, the minimum therapeutic was 1.5 ppm. We've actually seen marine velvet disease get through as high as 1.75 ppm, where we never saw that in the past. So that would be, it's anecdotal, but it's circumstantial evidence that possibly at the wholesale facility, at least with marine velvet disease, there are parasites that are actually building up, like in a resistance to copper and other medications.
Resistance.
Yes.
Okay. And so, like in my case, when I got the fish, I had it. It was not in copper right away. I didn't put it straight into copper. I just had it in observation. And when I put it in copper, I initially bumped it to 2. So I brought it up to 2 parts per million copper power. And I actually didn't notice any drop in, like, it was still developing, it was still getting stronger. So I went ahead and did a hydrogen peroxide dip on it to kind of clear it away to help the fish out, short term. And then I bumped it. It wasn't until I actually brought it up to 2.5 that I noticed symptoms disappearing again.
Right.
I don't know if that's because of, a resistant strain or something like that, but kind of more that anecdotal, support for something like that.
Right. And that's the new recommendation. I've actually had a lot of communication with the manufacturer of copper power, and we agreed that to raise the recommended level to 2.5 ppm, because at 2.5 ppm versus 2.0 ppm, you're not really going to see like much in the way of increased side effects. The appetite suppression, lethargy, and the other side effects from chelated copper. So it's a safer level to kill the parasites, and it seems to be there's minimal increased side effects to the fish. So I just thought it was just something prudent to do to take into account what might be happening if there are copper resistant parasites out there now.
Okay. So theoretically, if this was to persist, what would be, if it developed to a point where it was past that 2.5 level of resistance, what would be the next steps from, our perspective of what would we have to do to quarantine and clean these fish?
Well, so copper treats 2 parasites. Copper treats ick and velvet. So you would have to go with an alternative treatment. So if the fish had ick, for example, you could use hyposalinity, which is 1.009 Sg for 30 days. That treats ick. There's also another alternative treatment is tank transfer method, where you're moving the fish to a new quarantine tank every 72 hours. That treats marine ick. If it was marine velvet disease, my favorite treatment now for that is what I call hybrid tank transfer method, where you're moving the fish every 72 hours into a different quarantine tank, but you're also doing 2 hydrogen peroxide baths 6 days apart. The tank transfer methods take care of the 2 peroxide baths in between 2 of those transfers, take care of marine velvet disease. Another treatment it's fallen out of favor because of COVID, unfortunately, but I mean, I've had a lot of success with it, is using chloroquine phosphate. You can treat it 40 milligrams a gallon. It works pretty much the same as copper. Of course, because of COVID, it's a lot more difficult to get it because of that whole fiasco. But chloroquine phosphate works really well. Yeah. But it works. You know what? It's weird. It works really well. There are a few fish that don't tolerate it well. Fairy wrasses, no. Flasher wrasses do not tolerate it well. Hippotangs, strangely enough, do not tolerate it well. And the only Anthias I ever could get through it was the leertails. So it seems like there are some some species that do not tolerate it well. But for things, tangs and angels and your bread and butter fish, they all went through it with flying colors. So that would be an alternative for both ick and velvet. Yeah.
So what would your suggestion be for wholesalers and retailers instead of, subtherapeutic treatments?
There's so many things. They could, for example, instead of using subtherapeutic copper, they could use commercial grade UV sterilizers. That would keep the parasites at a sublethal concentration without exposing them to any chemicals. Obviously, the downside to that, that's expensive. You sometimes have to replace a lamp every 6 months. So, that's a cost thing. Ozone is another great, I call it a disease management tool for keeping parasites. I mean, ozone is a strong oxidizing agent. It keeps parasites at a sublethal concentration without the use of chemicals. You can plumb in actually a diatom filter. There's large pool grade diatom filters that you can actually plumb into a marine aquarium, which siphon out and trap the free swimmers into the diatomaceous earth. That's another management tool. I tell you, one thing that the wholesalers could do would really up their game would be upping their nutrition. So a lot of wholesalers, I'm not going to say all, but some of the wholesalers I'm familiar with, look, these fish, come in from collectors. They've just been plucked out of the ocean, and they're fed flake food and pellets. I mean, most fish that are newly, in captivity are not going to eat flake and pellets. If the wholesalers would do things like actually feed them mysis shrimp, clams, scallops, things like that, things they would actually possibly eat, then that would in turn, the fish would be healthier, and then they would have a better immune system to withstand the parasites initially. I think, I was actually thinking about this earlier today because I knew this what we're going to talk about, and it's a tricky thing because there's two sides to this argument. We as hobbyists here, we're like, look, these are live animals. They should be treated better. They should be exposed to proper treatments, not improper treatments. They shouldn't be used like disposable commodities. We're not talking about like a TV here that you're moving down the supply chain. You're talking about a live animal. But try to be a little bit unbiased here and see the other side of the argument. The wholesalers and the retailers are like, look, we have to make money, or we're not going to be in business. So these techniques that they utilize, they're utilizing it because the fish starts at the collection facility overseas, and then it moves to the wholesale facility, and then it moves to the local fish store or online retailer, and then it moves to the hobbyist. So the goal is to move the product down the supply chain as quickly as possible, because because the product is perishable. If the product dies, they would rather the product die with a hobbyist, because then everybody has made their money, along the supply chain. So when you and I've done this before, when you approach wholesalers and you start talking about things like UV sterilizers, ozone, better nutrition, feeding the fish like mysis shrimp instead of flake food and pellets, they come back to me and say, well, can you tell me how to do that and still stay in business and still be a profitable business? And I really don't have a good answer for that, because I'm not familiar with the finances of running a wholesale facility, how profitable it is and how much profit margin they have to play with to implement these other things I'm talking about. Obviously, just treating with subtherapeutic copper is a cost-effective way of dealing with the problem. And then you know what? That's not the only thing they do. They treat with subtherapeutic copper. Some wholesale facilities will dose PraziPro, they'll just buy praziquantel. They'll do that to keep worms under control. They'll sometimes dose metronidazole, which treats Brookeneuronema. I know some wholesale facilities are using hydrogen peroxide. They're actually dosing it into the systems. So the subtherapeutic copper is just one of many, we'll just say, chemicals that they're using to keep pathogens at bay.
Okay. Do you think that, so being in the industry for a little while, do you think that there's been a progression? Have those, practices gotten better, or is it honestly, roughly the same? And if so, is the push going to have to come from, us as the consumers just demanding that this becomes, the new norm? And from a retail perspective, I can understand that, you would buy from someone who has done the work, someone sort of like, marine collectors, you can buy there online. You used to sell them. I know on your forum, you have, some links to people that still sell properly, medicated fish. Is it just going to have to be, an increase in demand for those that kind of forces the market to change?
Honestly, you're right. You kind of hit the nail on the head. It's in the hands of the hobbyists. It's in the hands of the consumer. there are choices that we can make that will force change to happen. So just like what you said, if hobbyists choose to buy from quarantine vendors, vendors that quarantine the fish prior to selling, I'm a big supporter of Biota and other companies that sell fish that have been aquacultured. That's another way, is to buy from companies like that. Support companies like that. Don't support companies that I just call them fish flippers. They just get the fish in, they're just flipping it, moving it down the supply chain. But there's a trade-off. The trade-off is money. Obviously, like a facility like Biota that is actually taking the time to rear, baby fish to a point where they can be sold. Quarantine vendors that are taking on the risk of bringing these dirty fish in from overseas and from wholesalers, and they're going through the process of medicating the fish. I mean, when I was doing it, it was a 6-week process. I would medicate the fish for 2 weeks and run them through a battery of medications, and the fish would go into holding for like about a month, because I would both to ensure that the treatments were successful, and also I believed in feeding the fish like vitamin foods and good nutrition, because I wanted to build them up to a point where I felt like they were healthy enough to ship out to my customers. So when you take those kind of things into consideration, it's going to cost more money, and people have to decide, is it worth it to them? Are they willing to pay more for this? And but people can change the market with their pocketbook. They always can. They always have that ability. They just have to be willing to pay more for a better product.
Okay, because I know, like, when I've looked up, like, online, for example, it tends to add, I mean, you made a good point of the money, it tends to add almost, if it was a $150 fish, it's probably $250, so it adds a significant markup onto that fish. But at the same time, I know there's a lot of people that push back against, doing the quarantine and medication themselves because of, space, time, etc. So, it is a solid option, and I've considered it. Do I want to go through the energy to do it myself, or do I just want to pay someone to do it for me? And so, I kind of went through that toss-up, and I'm crazy, so I ended up doing it myself. But I can understand why a lot of people wouldn't. You brought up, like, Biota and how they're captive breeding a lot of fish. I think the most known is their yellow tangs, but they do a lot. With captive bred fish, are they just inherently clean from, the common diseases?
So that's an interesting question. I'm not intimately familiar with Biota's biosecurity, so I can't really speak to. I know the fish. I don't believe the fish are exposed to any sort of medications. The fish are bred in I'm assuming a clean environment. I'm going to be blunt about this. The only, because on my forum, there are a lot of people that support quarantine vendors, but there's a lot of people that support Biota. And I know a lot of them are ordering direct from here's the trick. Here's the key. You have to get the fish direct from Biota. You don't, if the fish is a Biota aquaculture fish, but it's bought from a local fish store, well, yeah, you need to treat that just like any other fish. You need to run it through a battery of medications, because it's sharing water with wild caught fish that could have who knows what. But I've noticed if the fish is bought directly from Biota, the only thing I've ever seen people say on my forum is they got flukes, which is pretty easily treatable with Prosecro, right? So if you're going to get something in your system, or you're going to
usually not very fatal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I've never seen an instance of anyone saying they got ick, they got velvet. So I like I said, I'm not familiar with their biosecurity. I'm assuming it's pretty good, because otherwise we would be seeing more instances of more virulent diseases. So I would I tell people, look, no matter where you buy the fish from, at least set up an observation tank, put the fish in observation, maybe observe it for a couple of weeks, and just be sure it's clean. I'm a big proponent of what I call power feeding fish when they're in an observation tank. I mean, I will feed them like 6-7 times a day, very small, frequent feedings throughout the day, because I'm trying to build this fish up, because, sometimes you put a fish in the DT, the other fish, bully it, beat it up, and you want it to be in its best top condition to withstand that conditioning period,
So it's as healthy as possible before it's stressed from other factors, which are
Exactly.
unavoidable.
Exactly. So like when you're,
Okay.
so conversely, when you're buying a fish from a local fish store that's say not biota, not quarantine, and you're dropping it right in your DT, the fish may have not even, the last meal that fish may have actually eaten was out in the ocean. So you're taking a stressed fish that already has a compromised immune system, you're dropping it in to your DT, which you may have healthy fish in your DT, but then once your healthy fish start beating up on the sick one becomes sort of a kind of a reservoir for any parasites that it brought in with it, and it sort of is what fuels the outbreak and kills all your other fish.
Propagating them through the rest of the tank.
Yes.
That makes sense. So I think the other thing that scares people from doing this is, okay, so I've quarantined the fish, I've medicated it, it's been observed, I'm 100% or as close to 100% sure that it is healthy. And I put it in my display tank, but I didn't quarantine, my corals, or I bought inverts or something like that. So is it, pointless to go through all of that work to get the clean fish if you're just going to introduce them another way to the tank?
Unfortunately, kind of yes, because I'm seeing more and more incidents where I know, people that are quarantining the fish, just like you mentioned, but then what they're doing is they're getting like an order of snails or they're getting corals and they're not quarantining those. And then what happens is so the fish carry in what's called the trophon, which that's the life stage of ick and velvet that the fish carry. However, there is what they call an egg stage, which is the tomont stage, which can insist to hard surfaces. So snail shells, hermit crab shells, LPS corals, they have that stony base to them. Frag plugs, a lot of people don't think about that. Frag plug is a great place for a parasite to insist to. So unless you're isolating your corals and inverts to a fishless frag tank-like environment for 6 weeks, the odds are eventually something is going to be introduced, ick or velvet. So I'm not going to say it's completely worthless to not quarantine your fish if you're not going to quarantine corals and inverts, but don't be surprised if you are quarantining your fish and you get a disease in your DT after adding, like it seems to happen so many times. People say, oh, I got in, 50 snails. And like a week or two later, they're like, I've got ick or velvet. And the outbreak probably came from one of those shells, unfortunately.
All right. So I think the key to what you said was fishless. So what is the procedure for, or what is your recommendation for quarantining those, like snails and corals and stuff?
So what I prefer to do is to set up basically a miniature version of my DT. I mean, it doesn't have to be as elaborate. Like, on one of my frag tanks, I just basically HOB'd everything. I didn't have a sump. I just took like a 29-gallon tank, had a HOB filter, HOB skimmer, had some T5 lighting. You probably get some cheap, LEDs to do the same thing. Good flow, maybe put like an MP10 or something in there, if the tank is small enough, and have your frag rack on top, and you can put your new frags up there. Just maybe, you just need some rock and sand for filtration on bottom. And, leave a lot of sand on the bottom. So especially like your snails and hermit crabs or whatever have that. And, pretty much it's just a matter of putting any new corals or inverts in that type of system for 6 weeks. And they're good to go, because what happens is the tomonts within the 6-week time, the tomonts will rupture and release free swimmers into the water, which will seek out fish to infect. The free swimmers don't find fish because there's no fish present in the system. So basically you starve the parasite to death. And it seems to work. I've never had an incident. I've been doing this for 10 years, and I've never had an incident of any diseases getting into my DT from corals or inverts by doing this. I'm trying to think, excuse me. It's pretty much that cut and dry. Of course, it's another tank that you have to set up, which, a lot of people don't want to hear that because, whatever, but that's really all there is to it. It's pretty easy.
Okay. Now, so I get an order of snails in, and those sit there for 6 weeks. If I add a coral to that same tank on, week 3, does that 6-week period start over, or no, because they're not ever finding a fish? to continue that life cycle through?
Kind of yes and no, because so like tomotes, once they've encysted, they can't move. They're not motile, so you don't have to worry about that. However, what you would have to worry about, and the odds are very low, is you'd have to worry about. So let's say you added some snails, and like you said, 3 weeks later you're adding corals, vice versa. So when the 6 weeks is up on the one you added first, there is a possibility that there could be free swimmers active in the water from one you added later. Now, free swimmers do not adhere really to corals and inverts. So what I tell people to do is look, if that's the situation, if you're not quarantining in batches and you're kind of, you're overlapping, we'll just say it was a coral. So if the coral is scheduled to come out before the snails, take the coral, take like a bucket, like a pitcher of water, of DT water, pour it over it. Or, a lot of people do coral dips. That will suffice. Pour it over it and just pour it into a bucket to be thrown away. What you're doing is you're throwing any free swimmer that just inadvertently landed on that animal, you're just kind of rinsing it away.
Washing it away. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing I want to say, I just thought about the one thing that you do have to do with a coral and invert QT, you have to do a lot of supplemental feeding. So because you don't have fish in there, they're not pooping, you're not feeding as much because you're not having that I can't think of, protein in the water to actually feed them. You have to do a lot of supplemental feeding. So like for snails, you're not going to get as much algae growth in a fishless system. So I tell people, look, they sell these little algae tablets. You can clip nori to a clip and they'll eat that. Make sure that you're feeding the animals supplemental feeding throughout the period, because there's not going to be the nutrients in the water that otherwise would be there to fuel algae growth and to fuel like the coral growth.
Got it. Because you don't have the waste from the fish, you have to supplement that other ways.
If you got LPS corals, go in there a couple of times a week with a pipette or something and shoot like mysis shrimp or some small meaty foods, at the LPS at night when their sweepers are open so that they can get nutrition, because they're not going to get as much out of the water as they used to, because there's not as much, stuff in the water without fish being there.
So just more broadcast feeding of various options.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. I think that's one of the things that's a little worrying about a fishless system is you hear, so much of the nutrients comes from the fish. Am I going to be okay with a simple setup that doesn't have that component? So you're saying, just...
Yeah. Supplemental feed. And, a lot of people are like, well, what if my PO4, my NO3 bottom out in a fishless frac tank? You can dose those. There's actually on my forum, we have products and stuff. We don't sell them, but it's a guy that wrote like a post, and you can dose PO4 and NO3 back to the water to get your nitrates and phosphates where you think they need to be for whatever corals that you're quarantining,
I'm actually dosing those to my display tank right now because they bottomed out because I just don't have enough stuff in there. So, I'm fighting a dino problem. So that's been fun.
That's the worst. Oh, I hate that. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's been a battle. So it's not as pretty of a display as it should be, but getting there. Okay. So I watched a lot of your videos, and mind you, these span across, the last 5 years or so. And you, a couple years ago, mentioned, and you might not remember, but you mentioned a theory that, some really established tanks have an easier time with disease because it's potential that, some of the bacteria building up or something like that is actually, fighting the disease and kind of, acting as a predator for that disease. Have you seen any evidence for that, or has there been any kind of progression in that hypothesis?
Very little. I mean, it's like a pet theory of mine that in the ocean, there are microorganisms. I mean, everything's got a predator, right? So there are microorganisms that are found in the rock that actually prey upon, we'll just say, parasite tomotes. I did have an exchange one time with, I forget his name. He's one of the authors of one of the studies that I referenced. And he is a marine biologist in Israel. And he's actually one of the ones that actually kind of got me thinking about this, because he suggested to me that because I asked him that because his study he did was in a sterile flask with the aid of antibiotics specifically. So what he said to me, he says, well, in more reef-like conditions in the ocean, he would expect bacteria to actually gnaw on and damage tomounts, making them not viable. Now, I've also, so that was one thing that kind of got me going. I'm like, well, he's kind of saying this. I've also found that there's been some studies that velvet dinospores, which is the free swimming stage of velvet, baby brine shrimp actually consume those. So again, in the wild, in the ocean, on the reef, you've got brine shrimp, baby brine shrimp. Well, baby brine shrimp are actually rabid consumers of velvet dinospores, which are the free swimming stage. So again, it's another evidence that here is an animal that preys upon parasites that afflict fish, which probably further explains why you don't have these crazy outbreaks of ick and velvet, on like the Great Barrier Reef or anything like that. But other than that, evidence of that is really hard to come by. Most of the studies are always done, most of the studies that I reference are actually done for the aqua farming industry for food fish, because that obviously, they're funding the studies, and
Where
I just
funding is.
Yeah, so they're always studying it, like, okay, what works in that, like an aqua farming setting, and they're trying to find ways to combat parasites and worms in that setting to keep the food fish long enough to rear, to obviously to sell. So it's really difficult to find studies where it's for aquariums or even like out in the ocean, because they're just not studying that. There's no money to fund those kind of studies.
Yeah, unfortunately, hobbyists don't have a wealth of money to put behind projects like this. But I mean, that would be amazing if something like that were to be developed. Where it was like a predatory kind of response to cleaning out your DT. I mean, think about the application of that for the hobby would just be amazing. Well, so if anyone's watching this that wants a project.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely, because that's like something. It's a pet theory. It's unproven. I mean, I think it makes sense, but I mean, there's no there's no direct evidence to support it. Now, people that are listening to this, one thing you can do to make your fish themselves more parasite resistant is nutrition. That is something that's so overlooked in a hobby. I mean, so many people are like, just throw some flake food and pellets in the tank, and that, excuse me. A fish's immune system is directly fed by its gut flora. So we really have to be feeding our fish better if we want their immune systems to be heightened.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, that applies to everything. It's easy to walk by the tank, you throw in some pellets and you walk away. But I mean, if you or I just ate the same thing every day, we would not be healthy. We might live for a long time, but we would not be healthy.
We have to look at what fish eat in the ocean, and we have to replicate that. We can't. They don't eat flake food. They don't eat pellets. And I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with that. As sort of look, I'm busy. I need to do this really quickly, like as a supplemental feeding. But their primary diet should be things like oysters and scallops and shrimp and crustaceans and same things that they eat in the ocean. And I'm not trying because I don't really support any, but there are like LRS foods. There's rods. I think there's another food called Rogers food that if you actually look at the ingredients of these frozen foods, it actually contains some of the ingredients that I'm mentioning. Or if like here people in Florida, they just make their own. They go to the seafood market. There's a guy here who makes it and he sells it to everybody on the panhandle. He buys scallops and oysters and shrimp and all this stuff, and he's making his own food blend. In his fish, he doesn't quarantine. In his fish, he doesn't have outbreaks. His fish are a lot healthier because what he is doing is he is giving through proper nutrition. He is feeding the fish's gut microbiota, which is in turn fueling their immune system. So the immune system is going to be stronger than somebody that's just feeding flake food and pellets.
And I think that's a good point, which might be, a cheaper option, for people that are coastal. I mean, same thing, I'm in Massachusetts, there's plenty of seafood here, and
Mhm.
It might not be from the exact same region of the ocean, but it's going to be a lot closer than something that's been sitting in a jar, dried for who knows how long.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you got the time and you want to put it all together, there's like recipes online. There's the guy's name is Aaron Home on my form. He's got his recipe that he's actually posted the ingredients, how many pounds of whatever he does to make his food. And I mean, I've used it. It's great stuff. So that's all you have to do.
Yeah, I'll link it in the description below so people can have access to that. Because I think that's useful information I have, which a lot of people overlook. Like I know I have an auto feeder on the tank that feeds a little bit of pellet while I'm at work, but then I feed frozen, in the morning. So because I know I'm not around to do frozen multiple times a day, but at least I can get a good feeding of frozen and then supplement it with the pellet as opposed to just relying solely on that.
Yeah, and that's really what it comes down to. Just the flake and pellets. It should be a supplemental thing, not the primary thing. Like I kind of used to do the same thing, just out of time constraints. Would do, I had an auto feeder and do pellets, but then, in the evening or the morning, whichever, I had more time, I'd make sure the fish got a good feeding of frozen food.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're a big advocate also for multiple smaller feedings. So like
Yes.
In a dream situation, where you're home all day, maybe you're working remote or something like that, how many times do you think you should be, breaking that feeding up across a day?
I would do it 4 or 5 times a day. I mean, if you're home all day long and you've got the ability to feed your tank multiple times a day, I would feed 4 or 5 times a day. But here's the thing: very, very small feedings. I mean, don't dump a lot of food in. Maybe go over there, squirt a little bit of food. The fish will eat it all up in a matter of 5-10 seconds. That's good. 2-3 hours later, do the same thing again. So those small, frequent feedings, I think, really helps. Because again, in the ocean, what do fish do? They're looking for food all day long, right? If you've ever been like scuba diving or even snorkeling on a reef, you'll see fish. They're constantly picking at the rock. The carnivores are looking usually for like amphipods or copepods to eat. The tangs and the herbivores are looking for algae to eat. Fish eat all day long. So I just feel like if we can replicate that in our aquariums, and I think our fish will be healthier. I'm also a huge proponent of nori. I think nori is great. I feed my fish nori on a clip every day. They get nori. It's a great source of iodine. It has a lot of other, nutritional benefits. Another thing you can do is you can soak your food in vitamins. They sell, I know, like there's some out there like Cellcone, Zocone, and Vitachem, but you can actually just take regular vitamin C, and you can put a couple of drops of that into your food, mix it into like a slurry, and you can do that. Vitamins, probiotics. If you adding probiotics to the feed is very important. Amino acids. There's a lot of different things that it takes time, and it's more time and energy and money, but it's little things that we can do for the fish to be more healthy in our care.
Fair enough. Okay. So we're kind of jumping back a little bit, but there was one thing I wanted to ask earlier, and I just forgot. When we were talking about inverts and stuff, is there, for someone that does not want to set up an independent system, either they don't have the time, space, money, whatever it is, are there vendors that are, raising those in fishless systems that are reputable and you can get clean inverts from? You see it for fish, but it's hard to find for inverts.
So here's the thing. I don't know anyone that does cleanup crew. And I know that a lot of people have been asking for that, a vendor that would sell like, clean, cleanup crew. I've not seen that. So snails and hermits and things like that. So let me just point this out though. Not every invert is capable of harboring tomotes. So people that are like, they come to me and they're like, look, I got algae problems. What do? I don't have 6 weeks to quarantine some snails. Urchins. So in the study that was done, sea urchins will not carry any parasites. There's something about them that the protomon is not able to insist upon them and form tomones. So tuxedo urchins, pincushion urchins are both reef safe, and I just recommend you take it. Just, again, we talk about a little bit of DT water, just in case there was a free swimmer attached, just kind of rinse it. Those could be just rinsed and go right into your DT. Those do not have to be quarantined. So that can be kind of a stopgap measure until you can actually, the time to quarantine some snails and everything. Corals, there is a vendor on my site. There's actually two: Premier Reefs, which is on my forum, and Terra Reef. Hope I'm saying that right. I should pay more attention. But there's if you go into my forum and you look under the quarantine vendors, there's two vendors there. Premier Reefs and Terra Reef are two that actually sell a 100% aquacultured quarantine corals that you can put right in your tank. You don't have to worry about diseases.
Don't have to worry about anything.
Right. But it's weird. Like it's weird to me that more people don't do that, because especially with aquaculture. But I think what happens a lot of times is, especially with these large aquaculture facilities, they got this thing about, well, I've got to have a RAS in there for pest control, and I have to have a tang in there for algae control. And I think sometimes what happens is they unfortunately put in a specimen that it does have a disease, and then that's kind of how it happens. They don't bother to quarantine the fish that are going to go in with their corals or inverts. So
it seems interesting, because to me it seems like it would be a lot easier for something like snails. I mean, snails are pretty hard to kill, to be honest. You throw them in a tank that's warm, and like you said, you feed with a bunch of nori, and you put bright lights over it to grow algae.
But what you said right there is what people won't do. So snails will starve to death, and what people for some reason won't do, they won't do the nori every day. They won't do the nori. They won't do the algae tablets. They put the snails in the fishless system for 6 weeks, don't ever do any supplemental feeding, and then they wonder why they all die. They just, maybe, look, maybe people just don't have the time on their hands to do this, but you have to, if you're going to quarantine cleanup crew snails and hermit crab and stuff like that, it's like daily you have to put nori in there. You have to put algae tabs. You have to constantly supplemental feed them, because algae is not going to grow in that fishless system. And that's just what people don't do when they lose them.
And even, I was even talking on the retailer perspective, people tank raising, cleanup crew and stuff like that. You would think they would have that. They've got the time because they've got staff. You would think they would have that, knowledge, and then they would have a product that they could sell as, hey, this is a clean, this is your sales point right there of this is 100% clean. It's never seen a fish, buy from here. Personally, like if I was doing it, that's, I think, the direction I would go. So it's interesting that it's not really an option.
I think it's because most local fish stores they're built on like moving livestock as quickly as possible. So like most fish stores that I've consulted for, and I know basically what it is, they get in their fish, they try to get them in before the weekend, right? So we'll say Tuesday or Wednesday, shipment comes in, they get the fish acclimated. Their goal is Sunday. By Sunday, they want like 90% of that gone, because they want to order. Because see, one of the things in the industry, the more you buy, the better deals you get, and also the better access you get to livestock. So, like a lot of times it's hard to get, well, I'm just going to use like rhomboid wrasses and lineatus wrasses, those kind of sought after fish that it seems like local fish stores don't get. The ones who are ordering, we'll just say 10 grand a week, $20,000 a week worth of livestock that is coming and going, and they have more purchasing power to get the better specimens, and they also get the better prices. So their goal is get the livestock in, and by Sunday evening, they want 90% of it gone, because they need to place another order on Wednesday. It's you're flipping livestock. What you're doing,
right?
So when you're quarantining it, you're holding on to it longer, and a lot of times, I know with the fish, they have to have a facility in the back, and it has to be back there for at least a couple of weeks, and then they move them up, and that really. And it's a matter of, are people willing to pay the extra money that the local fish store has to charge to compensate for not just the time they're keeping the animals, but like they don't have the buying power.
Space and resources. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because all of a sudden, instead of holding 1 week's worth of fish, you're holding 6. You know, to move at the same pace, you'd have to hold, you know, and essentially have 6 separate rooms, I guess.
I used to buy fish from my wholesalers about, it was probably every 4 to 6 weeks, just depending on how long it would take me to, because, you know, I was basically like, I cannot buy any more fish until my fish are out of quarantine and observation in my quarantine tanks. I'd have to tidy them up, whatever. And quite frankly, I got the garbage. I mean, I just got what was ever left over. I would order, like, you know, I had a long list of fish. Sometimes I would go on the website and I would see the fish available. Very rarely did I ever get what I even ordered. I just kind of got whatever they would send me. And when I dug more into it, is what I was told is like, well, you're not ordering enough. You're only ordering every 4 to 6 weeks. We're gonna prioritize the customer who's spending 10, 20,000 every single week. And we're going to prioritize him over you because you're not spending enough money. So then again, that's the handicap that quarantine vendors face because they don't have that buying power, you know?
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and that's a hard problem to solve because you went from the wholesaler's perspective, it makes sense. You want to, you know, give your stuff first to the guy who's writing you a big check every week, but, you know, at the same time, it's just making the process of having, you know, eventually a sustainable system for clean fish that much harder.
Exactly. The whole supply chain is built around move the product down the supply chain as quickly as possible because everybody makes money that way. When you're a quarantine vendor, we'll just say even for corals, and you're buying very little and you're holding on to the product longer because you're actually trying to care for it and be sure that you're selling a healthy animal, you actually get punished by the industry in a sense because they're not making as much money off of you. So it's really hard to reconcile this, right? Because on one hand, you're like, well, you're trying to do what's right for the animal, but then, you know, the wholesalers are like, well, we got to make money. You know, we have to make money. We have bills to pay. We have employees to pay. And we know that Joe Blow, that's just flipping fish, he's a sure thing. And he's helping us to meet our overhead more so than you. So we're going to, you know, prioritize him and give him access to better livestock at better prices because we're more concerned about keeping him happier than you. I really can't argue with, I mean, it sucks, but I really can't argue it.
Right.
Right?
No,
you know?
I mean, you can't. The wholesaler has to keep the lights on.
Right.
But, right, it does suck. Like, that's hard to, and it's just perpetuating problems. So,
yeah,
that's going to be hard for the hobby to sort out.
If I won the lottery tomorrow, I would open up a wholesale facility in Los Angeles, and all we would sell only quarantine fish to local fish stores. We would, but I would be doing it with the understanding I wasn't really looking to make money. You know, I would try to break even or something on it, but I can only do that if I ever won the lottery someday.
Right. When you were quarantining fish and selling, how many were you able to process in one go? Like, how many fish did you roughly have at a time?
Let's see. So my quarantine system was at one time I had 840 breeders. So that's 320 gallons. So I had about 400 gallons of quarantine space and about 400 gallons of retail space, roughly. I think I actually had more of retail observation than I did because I always had like overflow. I could usually do about 70. I mean, if I really wanted to push it, I could do more than that, but usually around 60 or 70 was our orders that we would get in. Of course, it's dependent upon size. You know, if I was ordering larger fish because customers or clients were wanting, you know, more show size fish, I'd have to obviously not order as many fish because the larger fish take up more room. But if it was just a regular bread and butter order, I call it maybe 60 to 70. There's a guy on my forum. His name is Jeff. He owns Fish Hotel, and he's doing really well with it because I'm no longer selling quarantine fish, and he's one of the vendors on my forum. He's doing extremely well with it. He's really improving the success rate of it. And I want to say he's doing, I could be wrong, I want to say he's doing close to 100 at a time now. So he's sort of like raised the bar with that. But again, the frustrating part is, you build relationships with customers and clients, and they come to you with a wish list, and they're like, well, these are the fish that I want, in my tank. Can you buy them and quarantine them and sell them to me? And again, we go back to, it's difficult for me to ever do that, because a lot of times the fish on their wish list were fish I never could get access to from the wholesalers because of my low purchasing power. So then that becomes, then you have to, will a customer work with you, and are they willing to have substitutes because you're not able to, to fill their stocking list, their wish list and everything. Mm-hmm. But I could usually do about, getting back to your question, 60 or 70 that I would get in. Once I got that batch in, you're looking at a 4 to 6 week process from the time I get them in, quarantine them, to the time I feel comfortable getting them out the door, selling them. And quite frankly, there were fish that, for whatever reason, I would hold on to them for months because I didn't feel they were ready. I mean, if it's not a fish that I'm going to put in my tank, I'm not going to sell it to somebody. So, sir, you'll have these little oddball fish that sometimes, for whatever reason, they have a lingering bacterial infection. They have lingering lymphocystis, which is a virus. Sometimes fish, just for some reason, aren't putting on weight like they should. That can turn into months that you're holding on to the fish, doing conditioning until, it's a judgment call, until I felt like, okay, this fish is healthy. This fish is ready to be sold.
Yeah, and that's just adding on to your cost,
Exactly.
A lot more time and space taken up. So let's see, 60 to 70 every 4 to 6. So you're talking about, 800 fish a year?
Yeah.
So, that's much smaller numbers than, your average fish store.
Right. Now, there's people like Marine Collectors is a good example. He's got a facility in LA, and I'm sure he does. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know what he does, but I'm sure he does thousands of fish a month. He's got a large facility. I was doing it out of my house, so I was very limited. Right. To what space I had to work with, but it's difficult to justify. Every vendor on my farm is doing it out of their house because the risk of going into a commercial space where you have a lease and rent and all that, and hoping that you can make that money just enough to cover your overhead, it's daunting. So it's risky, so a lot of people don't want to take that risk on.
Yeah, it's a big jump. To open the facility, it's not just the lease, it's all the equipment. That's a lot of tanks. And even if you're just using 40 breeders or something, which are cheap, it's still a lot of tanks to fill out a facility or something like that.
Right.
I could see why that would be very, daunting. So,
and what people don't realize too, it's the quarantine. Then you have to have a separate area for like retail observation. And then you have to be very paranoid about cross-contamination. So like, for example, in the morning, first thing I always did was I took care of the quarantine fish. That was the first thing I did every morning, took care of them. Then I went and took a shower because I'm not going to risk cross-contaminating my retail observation system. Then I went and worked over there. Then it was shipping, and that's a whole nother thing you have to do, where you're catching the fish, you're boxing the fish up, you're having to check. Like I would check always, not only where the destination, where the fish was going, but I also would check the hub, because the fish are going to go from from A to B to C. We use really thick bags. We use heat packs. We use cold packs. I'm proud to say I think I did it for 3 years, and I think maybe we had less than 5 DOAs. I'll say in 3 years of shipping.
That's
fish.
Really good.
But that was going above and beyond. I actually a lot of times I would actually take a loss on the shipping, because my cost to ship the fish out was actually more than what I was charging the customer, because I think I capped it at $50 at the time. So I was trying to go above and beyond. Because I'm going to be frank with you, I'll be damned if I just spent 6 weeks on these fish and they're going to die in shipping. No, that's not happening.
Right, because it was a little cold and, wherever.
Yeah. Right.
No.
And my vendors have the same attitude, or they wouldn't be vendors on my farm, that, we're going to go all out and we're going to do everything we can to ensure that these fish make it to their destination healthy and happy.
Right. And I mean, I think that's a good practice, because like you said in the beginning, I mean, you're not dealing with a toaster oven. If a toaster oven comes and it got beat up in shipping, it's a piece of metal, whatever, you're dealing with a live animal. You don't want to just, if you think about it in terms of something that's a lot more common, if we mailed puppies and 1 in 10 showed up dead, people would say that's horrific.
Right.
The whole practice would be shut down. But somehow, when you mail fish or something like that, 1 in 10 show up dead, and people go, "It's okay, I'll mail you another one."
Yeah.
You're still shipping a living, animal. That's not, it's not okay. It's fine, I'll mail another. So,
and, I think it's a public perception thing, because just like you said, for some reason, people are very, like, they've become more aware of, like, like dogs and cats, like puppy mills and things like that. But then, for example, when it comes to like fish, for some reason, they don't get the same attention, I guess, or these advocacy groups don't really pay attention to that as much as they do dogs. Same thing with birds. I mean, I know some local fish stores, they'll sometimes get in birds that are like, they're all dead. For something happened, the heat or something, and you'll have 50 parakeets and they're all dead. And that's just not frowned upon, like if it were 50 puppies or 50 cats for some reason.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of pressure against, the puppy mills and stuff like that, because, I mean, I know like the PetSmarts and stuff like that, at least here in Massachusetts, they don't really sell cats and dogs like they used to. It's hard to go into one of those chain pet stores and buy, a dog or a cat like you used to be able to, I don't know, not even 5-10 years ago. But there's been no pressure, like you said, towards less common pets.
Right. Yeah, you'll get in the same store, you'll go and you'll see like dead fish, even in the freshwater, dead fish in the tanks, and nobody really seems to care for some reason. So it's a public perception thing,
I think it's even a little bit on the hobbyists, though, because I've seen it, heard it, fish die. You've got these lots of, I mean, fish will outlive your dog usually. You can get 15, 20 years out of a fish if it's healthy. But a lot of people just go, "Oh, fish died," and they go out and buy another. And it's like, no, we need to figure out why and prevent that, from happening, because they shouldn't just die.
Right. Yeah, you're right. It's one of those things that I don't know how to fix it. It's strange. It's like, how do you fix it? What do you do about it? It's just, maybe eventually people will, demand it. But for now, it does not seem, I don't know. I hate to say this. Some people look at fish as disposable commodities. Squirrels and inverts are just disposable commodities. They're just constantly replacing them. And they don't really, like you said, there's some fish, tangs and angels, should live 10, 20 years easy. Clownfish can live to 30 years or longer. So, but people, that just doesn't seem to be the norm. Unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you say that there has been a big push, because back in the day, there was no such thing as, medicated quarantines or anything like that. You bought fish, you threw it in the tank, you just saw what happened. Would you say there has been a big push in a positive direction with the community?
As far as like buying quarantine fish?
Even not as far as buying quarantine fish, but in the desire to, quarantine it yourself. Because I don't know, coming into this side of the hobby, I don't know if it's because this is the information I'm seeking out. And so that's why I'm seeing so much information about, how to go about this, how to, quarantine, or if it's because the hobby is making a move in the right direction.
I think more people are becoming aware that quarantine is at least something they should consider. So my first exposure to quarantining fish was in the in the mid 90s. So I worked for a aquarium maintenance company, and I learned, that was my first, actually, it was the first time for me actually ever quarantining fish. They taught me how to, because we had over 100 clients, and all of the fish had to be quarantined after we got them from the wholesaler before they went into the client's aquarium. So that ultimately became my job. I mean, they trained me to do proper quarantine on saltwater fish, and I was in charge of quarantining all the fish before they went into the client's aquariums. Now, at that time, this is like middle 90s, nobody quarantined. That was my first exposure to it. And I knew a lot of people in the hobby back then, and nobody quarantined their fish. However, reef tanks were less common. So what was happening in a lot of cases, if you got ick or velvet in your DT, you were usually had like a fish only system or whatever. So people were like, oh, I've got ick, I'm just going to dose copper in my DT. It'll clear it up in about a month, and I'll remove the copper. That was a lot more common. Because we now have, everybody's got a reef tank, that's not, you can't just do that, obviously, with copper. So, but I think, so then about 15, 20 years ago is when I first was online, like on Reef Central. And that was the first time I actually saw there was like a forum or a sub forum on there that was dedicated to quarantining. But back then I would think, I would say most people, they still weren't quarantining. They knew about it, but it was more, so I guess the shift has been this. Back then people were like, help my fish have ick and velvet, what do I do? And then people like myself, and there were others, would say, well, this is what you do. You pull all the fish, you quarantine, you medicate with copper, you go fallow. It was always an emergency situation, where today I'm seeing more shift in attitude, where people are like, okay, I don't want to get the disease in my DT in the first place. What can I do preemptively to quarantine these fish to prevent that from ever happening? So I would say more people are aware of it. There's been more information, more education about it. But I still think because of the resources that are needed and the risk involved in quarantining your own fish, I think a lot of people are resistant to doing it because they're just like, I don't want to do this. Like, and I really get that. It's like, look, I've got this beautiful DT in my living room, and that was hard enough to convince my wife or my husband that I needed this. Now you're trying to tell me I need a quarantine tank, and I got to have a fishless frag tank. And it's just not something that people want to hear. And it's not something that they want to tell their spouse, because you kind of turn your house into an aquarium is what ends up happening.
Oh, yeah. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment. And when I told the wife, oh, yeah, I'm going to get it, start setting up this tank, she was, okay, yeah, that's great. And then I was like, oh, yeah, and I'm going to get, these 2 10-gallon tanks over here to quarantine. And then, I haven't even mentioned the fact that I got to quarantine like other stuff, because I haven't put any coral in the system yet. I'm still trying to fight through, like I said, dinos and stuff like that. But, so that conversation hasn't even come up of, oh yeah, I got another tank that's got to sit there for 6 weeks. So,
So just what you're saying, you're like, look, I'm like, I don't want to do this because, people are busy nowadays. I don't want to do this myself. I don't want to like fill my 1-bedroom apartment with multiple aquariums that are support tanks for my DT. And I don't want to have this conversation with my spouse about this because, it's already sometimes contentious just to have the tank in the first place, and the money is being spent on the tank. And now you're saying now we have to have additional tanks. So I think because of the practicality of it, then I think a lot of people are like, you know what? I think I'm just going to wing it. I think that I'm just going to see if I can get by without quarantining. I think that maybe I can try some garlic, or there's all these things out there, or I can, whatever. I can try to maybe skirt it and not do it. And what I've learned over time is this: you can't tell people anything. Look, people are going to do what they're going to do. They're going to try what they're going to try. People learn by doing. So the guy or whoever, girl, whatever, that goes and sets up a tank and doesn't quarantine, and they're like, I'm not quarantining, blah, blah, blah. Just let them do it. Unfortunately, what will most likely happen is they'll wipe out their tank, or they'll lose most of their fish. And at that point, there's a fork in the road, and they have a choice to make. They can get out of the hobby, which a lot of people do, or they can kind of reconsider their position because they learned from their own mistake that they made. And they can say, well, maybe I should think about quarantining. But it's kind of a conclusion that you have to reach yourself. You have to experience the heartbreak and the financial loss of losing all these beautiful fish, and then you kind of reconsider your position. And that seems to be, for a lot of people, how it happens.
Yeah, and it's, terrible to, hear that that's where most of that decision making happens. I mean, I went into it and I've had tanks in the past. Now, this is my first entry into like the reef tank side of things. But I've done saltwater, like cold saltwater tanks. I've done freshwater tanks, everything like that. But for me going into it, it was, I want to buy these fish. I want to have them for as long as possible. I don't want to, kill them off because one, I mean, the financial, if I put, I don't want to name the price because my wife is going to watch, but if I put, a lot of fish in this tank, I don't want to lose that. But at the same time, like I said earlier, I also just don't want to kill off a lot of animals because I didn't feel like doing the extra step.
Right.
So, it's hopefully as information becomes more readily available. I know you've done a lot to promote. I mean, you've got a lot of videos on your YouTube channel and your forum. You used to be on Reef to Reef, and now you switched over to your own forum. It's humble.fish, right?
Yeah, humble.fish. Yeah, it used to be a website, but it was just too much to maintain both the website and the forum. I had to pick one or the other, so I picked the forum. But all the information that used to be on the website is on the forum. I'm actually in the process of updating everything right now. Every day I'm updating one or two stickies, trying to get everything as current, good information as I can provide people with. And yeah, people can go on there. They can get information. We have a whole team now of fish disease experts and medics and other people that are, anything about reef discussion, we're ready to advise. And I try to push this. We provide help. We don't judge. So, somebody comes on and whatever, I'm not here to judge you and what maybe you didn't quarantine in the past or whatever it is. That's none of my business. I'm just here to help you and advise you and given whatever your situation happens to be, to give you the best advice I can give you to help you.
How do we fix it from here?
Right. How do we fix it? That's all we're worried about.
And I mean, I think that's good. There's no point in shaming people once the mistake has happened. I mean,
exactly.
We need to talk about, the mistakes and stuff like that.
Right. And I just want to point
happens.
out, for those who do not want to quarantine, like we actually have a section called fish disease management, and there are people there that are experts on that. And there's Paul B is a good example. He's like one of the most famous people in the world that doesn't quarantine. There's a protocol being developed. We're calling it in-tank peroxide dosing. My co-admin on the forum is Jessica, and she's actually, like how I do the peroxide bath, she's actually done this thing where fish get ichor velvet in their DT and their reef, and she has developed a methodology for them to dose peroxide directly into their reef tank. It's like a 6-week program. So we're trying to do both. We're trying to help people that want to quarantine. We're also trying to help people that just want to try to manage it and they don't want to quarantine. So, yeah.
So, yeah, it's good that information is, available nowadays. So, well, I don't want to take up all your time. I mean, we've been talking for a little while. But thank you so much for, agreeing to do this. And, hopefully some people will see this and get some valuable information. I'll link your forum and everything in the description to the video and, some stuff from what we've talked about. So people can go to those sites, and I've used your site a lot for how to do things. Like I said, I did a hydrogen peroxide dip. I actually did it wrong a little bit. I didn't do it static. I had an air stone in there. But it still helped. And because it was going into copper afterwards, I think it was fine, because my whole point was just relief and not full-on treatment. But I realized I rewatched one of your videos about it later, and I was like, I missed that part.
So information on it actually changed a little bit. I actually, because that's the thing, I'm constantly updating information because I'm learning new things. I actually did some testing. You can use an air stone during a peroxide bath. For that 30 minutes, it does not lower the concentration of peroxide.
Doesn't lower the... Okay.
No, it does not. Yeah, it does. I mean, you can do...
That makes me feel better then.
Yeah, but it doesn't... There's actually on Amazon, you can buy these peroxide test strips, and you can do like a before and after, And I did it multiple times with both using a air stone and a power head and everything else you can imagine. The peroxide level never changed at all over 30 minutes.
Right. At least not enough to make a difference or be noticeable on a strip.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. So maybe I didn't screw it up. But all right. Well, thank you for talking with me. And
all right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. If you stuck around through the whole video, hopefully you got some useful tips to kind of help you navigate through this process as you're trying to either set up your own tank or quarantine when you're adding new fish, whatever it is. But it was great speaking with Humble Fish. He has a ton of valuable information about this topic. Check out the link in the description. I linked both his YouTube channel and his forum. There's a ton of people on there, as he mentioned, that can help you with the problems you're facing with your tank without any shaming. It's a very friendly place. Everyone is very helpful, and it's been a lot of help to me, and I know it's been a lot of help to others. So check that out. Hit the like button on this video if you like the information you got, and subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date on what's happening in the future. I'm hoping to have some more interviews coming up over the next few months, and some more videos coming up as I set up this tank behind us.